Hi, I'm Deepti Vaghela. I am the manager of the Hydro Empowerment Network, a platform for advancing small-scale hydropower across the global south. This is the first edition of StreamSide Chats. It's an opportunity to get to know the practitioners that actually implement small-scale hydropower on the ground, along with multi-actors that have been supporting them along the way. Today, we have a number of guests. Our first chat will be with Mr. Divyam Nagpal. Divyam is a renewable energy specialist that has been supporting intergovernmental and governmental aspects of promoting renewables for several years now. I'd like to have Divyam join the chat.
Hi, Deepti.
Thanks, Divyam, for joining the chat. I'm wondering, based on your journey and what you see now, where do you think we should be focusing?
Thanks, Deepti. And thanks also for inviting me to be part of this first StreamSide chat. Indeed, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is disrupting life as we know it. Unfortunately, more for some compared to others. And it's really forcing us to rethink or think more broadly about the social and economic dimension of development as we move forward. So we've seen, for example, a tremendous loss of livelihoods, especially in the informal economies in developing countries. We've seen reverse migration, within countries, but also from outside countries into people going back into villages, which they initially fled because of lack of economic opportunities in the first place. And they're returning back to villages which do not have the job opportunities, and that's also that will eventually result into a huge income shock, right? There are countries, especially in South Asia, that get almost 25-30% of their GDP as remittances at the end of the day. So really, we don't yet know the full impact of the pandemic itself, but what we can tell already is that it's going to have a lasting impact on the socio-economic dimension besides the health side of the equation. And of course, governments are now thinking about the short-term measures that they need to take to soften the blow on communities, on the communities, but also on the MSME sector, and building the infrastructure to address the pandemic itself. But I think what's really important for us to be thinking about right now within the energy access community is to see how the long-term recovery from this pandemic needs to be shaped in the most appropriate and the right way. We've been hearing a lot about building back better and recovering better, and there's a lot of phrases that are going around. But at the end of the day, we really need, as we come out of this crisis, we need to build back a system that is more resilient from the perspective of the public services that we deliver. It's more resilient from the perspective of the local jobs that we create. We have to make the rural economies more resilient, so that this is not going to be the first shock. So there's going to be many shocks coming in the future, whether it's health related or it's climate related. Overall, we need to be creating a more resilient society moving forward, and an inclusive one. So I think in that sense, situating the energy access discussion moving forward, in terms of how our energy access efforts contribute to those broad objectives, will be particularly important and critical. I think we need to sort of start to move away from this thinking around, the number of kilowatt hours and kilowatts and number of systems, and start measuring our successes from those aspects, and start thinking about the services that we are delivering. Are we linking it to the livelihoods? Are we linking it to rural enterprise development? Are we sort of contributing and advancing those socioeconomic development objectives that will constitute what makes this recovery better compared to all else? And I don't think this is a call for action for just the practitioners themselves. There are a number of practitioners who've been following this approach, many of them within your network, for many decades now. But I think this is also a call for action in terms of how the financing institutions think about access, how the DFIs think about access, how NGOs think about access, and more importantly, how governments think about access, and how that has to be a central pillar of the recovery moving forward.
Among the various renewables you've worked on, what led you to have an interest in small scale hydro?
Mhm. Yeah, I think small scale hydro, the one of the fascinating things is, we often hear about solar, and there's a lot of talk about solar mini grids and solar home systems and whatnot. And there's of course a lot going on in that space, and things are moving quickly there. But I think there are some intrinsic benefits of micro hydro, which particularly sort of interested me. Especially when we first met a few years ago. And I think a couple of them being that the fact that they have a long track record of having been deployed, especially in South Asia, but also in parts of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. They have been deployed in certain countries where they've been operating for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And what's also interesting there is the fact that you've got value chains to develop these micro hydro solutions, which have in part been localized, right? So you've got a good healthy ecosystem of if you look at Nepal or Myanmar, some of the cases that hopefully we'll discuss later. They've been able to localize a lot of the turbine manufacturing, a lot of the skills development. They've built industries around it. So essentially, what's really happened, it's not been an outside technology just comes into a community to deliver an idea of energy access that has come from outside, but it's really something that's been a bottom up process of delivering access that's very well connected to what the aspirations of the communities are. And linked to that is how productive end users and livelihoods generation has been so closely tied to micro hydro development, and there's so much that we can learn from it. I just wished micro hydro would get almost as much attention as some of the other sectors do. But I think it's important that we shed as much light as possible on the tremendous benefits and the experience that the sector already has.
Yeah, it is very interesting to juxtapose what we know about micro hydropower with what you described as the current situation and the need to focus on resilience and long-term solutions that really bring socio-economic benefits. And it's not just micro hydropower. All kinds of energy access systems need to prove that in the long
Mhm.
run, and even at the get-go, there are there's definite benefit to local actors, and we have seen that long-term benefit is really dependent on local capacity and
Mhm.
the local change makers' ability to not only install and technically maintain, but build on to the system, uh, create more benefits from what was
Mhm.
provided.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the critical parts of the equation is also to try and be able to measure some of these impacts, right? And I think the fact that we've been traditionally been used to a very sort of standardized way of impact, measurement, fails to capture a lot of the things that you're talking about in terms of the long-term resilience side of the story. How is it that engagement of communities translates into those long-term socioeconomic dividends of energy access, and how we maximize that, right? So I think that has to be, it's funny because ever since COVID started, and we've all the discussion that has been happening, there's a lot of questions being raised, especially among the financing institutions, like, oh, do you have certain talking points for what the impact of energy access is, or what the outcomes of energy access is. And for me, I always thought that why would anybody want to be convinced that energy access actually brings certain kinds of benefits, right? But I think the new reality moving forward also is, just zooming back a bit, is that there's going to be extremely limited public financing that's going to be available moving forward. So governments post this COVID crisis, governments, national budgets, but also, from DFIs, etc., there's going to be a crunch, and they have competing priorities, and we do have to take that step back and not just ring fence existing commitments to energy access, which have already been insufficient, but also be able to sort of provide the metrics and the arguments and the evidence that investing in energy access, and especially investing in meaningful energy access, which micro hydro solutions are very capable of providing and have provided, yields very long-term socioeconomic dividends, and that it's a sector that's worth investing, and that it should be part of the priorities in the next 10 years that we have left to reach SDG 7. So I think linking up that, your arguments about the long-term impacts with the evidence, and then sort of connecting it to the national and the international discourse becomes very critical as we move forward from here.
Yeah. These are questions for our network, actually, as we move into our next phase. Where can we bring the most impact? And just assessing the situation as it continues to unfold, it definitely seems that our local practitioners, they do the work on the ground extremely well. But when it comes to engaging with multi-actors, whether it be government or donors or academia, there is a gap between, whether it's language or culture or just being in the field and not being accessible. I feel that there has to be more resilience in those change makers to engage with the ecosystem that brings financing and policy to the space. I'm wondering if there are specific directions that we could give to program designers around these aspects.
Yeah. So I think there's indeed, I think one of the sort of big challenges is to bridge that gap, like as you rightly mentioned. We've got practitioners, who are good at what they do. They can work with the communities, build up these systems, make sure these systems can run for 20, 30 years and ensure that they're sustainable and meet all of the, prerequisites that some of the other sectors are actually struggling to find answers to, right? But then also for them to be able to communicate the outcomes and be able to access the kind of financing and the kind of ecosystem support, that becomes a big issue. I mean, I would actually feel unfair in terms of putting the responsibility of also bridging the gap back onto the practitioners who are already doing a great job of actually putting up and developing the systems. But my suggestion would obviously be to make sure that we are able to sort of communicate as much as possible, the outcomes and the data, but also the stories from those projects and from those practitioners in the most easily digestible and the most relevant way, right? And I think platforms like these actually play a critical role in that, because it's not just a question of how many systems they've deployed. The real value actually lies in the story of how they went about in deploying those systems and how they addressed some of those issues and challenges that lie there. And I think if you're able to sort of communicate those stories to different practitioners, not just within South Asia, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa, that's just starting to explore micro hydro as a solution in some of the countries. I think it could be tremendous potential in terms of cross-regional exchange, and making sure that sufficient attention is provided to these sectors, and more importantly, sufficient support is provided to these sectors. So I think that two-way interaction between the practitioners themselves and the NGOs and the international organizations, that's something that we all have to sort of work on together, rather than something that just the practitioners themselves can do moving forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And there's one more burning question I have for you. We have talked over many years regarding productive end use and how that translates into impact. And as we continue to interface with government, donor programs, and even our practitioners, we see that the energy access work itself is so involved that we're all focused on that completely with complete momentum. But I mean, we see with COVID that we have to look at healthcare. We have to look at agri-processing, governance, where it actually relates to the political economy of many of these places. And I see that at kind of the funding level, there is an understanding that this needs to happen, but the channels don't seem to be there yet, even for communicating across. The other focus we are trying to look at is nature-based solutions, so eco-restoration, which completely aligns with small-scale hydropower, but we are still struggling to reach out to conservation reforestation programs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this has been a challenge for pretty much every energy access project as such, right? In terms of getting more productive end users into the systems, and very often, in fact, a lot of energy access projects actually look at productive end users almost purely from a sustainability lens, or even in some cases an afterthought, right? Especially, if you've got a grant or you've got some funding, you put up a project, you make sure it runs for a little while. What is your intrinsic motivation as the proponent of that project or a operator of that project to support the local communities and developing productive end users, right? Because that requires effort. It's much more than delivering kilowatt hours. It's about giving in the skill sets, making sure there's access to markets, making financing available for productive appliances. So there's a whole bunch of hand holding that needs to be done around that as well. So I think implicit within your question is is the fact that what we need is essentially a model where somebody has the incentive within whether it's a micro hydro project or any mini grid project for that matter, to be able to develop those productive end users and do the hand holding for the rural communities, right? Because there's a two-way benefit there. One benefit is, of course, for the mini grid itself in terms of load factors and sustainability. But at the same time, there's also a benefit in terms of the outcomes that we spoke about initially around livelihoods and resilience and job creations and all of those things. So I think what really it boils down to at the end of the day is to shift focus, as we spoke about earlier, start thinking about resilience and start thinking about livelihoods and services more strongly compared to number of systems and kilowatt hours. And secondly is to devise a model where somebody has the incentive to be able to work with the community to develop those productive end users and all of the ecosystem around that. And hopefully, I think I'm sure there's a number of examples even within your network that can sort of testify to how some of these things can work in actual practice.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for this insight. It's always a pleasure to connect with you.
Thank you.